They thought they had won. When billionaire conservationist Octavian Rice died, his greedy heirs inherited everything they ever wanted: millions of dollars, vast properties, and complete control over his legacy. But months later, during an emergency legal meeting, their own lawyer read a single sentence hidden inside a forgotten document, and froze. What followed destroyed fortunes, exposed betrayals, and revealed a plan decades in the making. Subscribe now and discover how greed turned an inheritance into a nightmare. My name is Marcus Velder. For 23 years, I worked alongside Octavian Rice, a man whose name carried weight in conservation circles across the country. He wasn't family. We shared no blood relation, no legal connection, and no inheritance ties. Yet by the end of his life, he trusted me more than anyone else. That trust would eventually place me at the center of a conflict that destroyed a powerful family from within. The story began in Blackstone Hills, where Octavian's sprawling estate overlooked thousands of acres of protected wilderness. People often assumed his family shared his passion for preserving the land. They were wrong. The first sign appeared even before his funeral. 3 days before the burial, I was reviewing operational reports inside the estate's administrative office when voices echoed through the hallway. At first, I ignored them. Then I heard laughter. Not nervous laughter. Not grieving laughter. Excited laughter. I stepped closer to the doorway and recognized the voices immediately. Celestine Voss, her younger cousin, Dorian Volek, and another heir named Selric Thorne. The three stood around a large map spread across a conference table. "What do you think this section is worth?" Dorian asked. "At least 60 million, Selric replied. Celestine smiled. "Probably more if we subdivide it." I looked at the map. It wasn't just any property. It was Silver Creek Wildlife Sanctuary, one of Octavian's most important conservation projects. The place where endangered species recovery programs had operated for nearly 2 decades. A location Octavian personally visited every month. Yet none of them discussed preserving it. They discussed selling it. I remained silent and returned to my office before they noticed me. That evening, I drove to Silver Creek. The sanctuary sat nearly 2 hours away from Blackstone Hills. The roads wound through forests and protected valleys before opening into a large conservation zone. As sunset approached, I parked beside the research station. Everything looked peaceful. Researchers moved between buildings. Wildlife specialists prepared evening surveys. Visitors were gone for the day. The place felt alive. And suddenly, I remembered a conversation from 3 years earlier. At the time, Octavian and I had been standing on the observation deck overlooking the wetlands. He seemed unusually serious. "Marcus," he said. "Yes. One day they'll come for this place." I looked at him. "Who?" "My heirs." I laughed. He didn't. That was when I realized he wasn't joking. "They won't understand why this matters," he continued. "They'll only see numbers." I asked whether he planned to stop them. His answer surprised me. "No. No." He shook his head. People reveal who they truly are when nobody blocks their choices. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Now, standing at Silver Creek years later, those words returned with uncomfortable clarity. The next morning, preparations for the funeral intensified. Guests arrived from across the country. Business leaders, government officials, scientists, environmental advocates. Many had worked with Octavian for decades. Most appeared genuinely devastated. The family, however, seemed focused elsewhere. During the reception before the funeral service, I noticed several heirs gathered around financial advisors. They weren't discussing memories. They weren't discussing Octavian's accomplishments. They were discussing valuation estimates. One advisor carried a thick folder labeled property assets. Another had spreadsheets displayed on a tablet. I watched Celestine speaking confidently with a consultant. She pointed toward sections of land highlighted in red. The consultant nodded repeatedly. Neither looked upset. Neither looked distracted by grief. Hours later, the funeral began. The chapel was filled beyond capacity. People shared stories about Octavian's dedication, generosity, and determination. Several speakers described how he spent millions protecting habitats that generated little financial return. Others spoke about education programs that introduced thousands of children to conservation. Listening to them, I felt proud of everything he had built. Then I looked toward the front row. Celestine was checking her phone. Dorian was whispering to Selric. Neither appeared interested in the ceremony. The contrast was impossible to ignore. After the burial concluded, guests slowly departed. The family returned to the estate. That evening, I found myself standing alone inside Octavian's library. The room had barely changed in 20 years. Shelves lined every wall. Documents filled cabinets. Maps covered several tables. This room had served as the headquarters for many of his biggest projects. A few minutes later, the doors opened. Several heirs entered. They apparently assumed nobody else was there. I remained near the back of the room, partially hidden by one of the shelves. Celestine immediately walked toward the central table. She spread out multiple property maps. "Let's talk realistically," she said. The others gathered around. "What goes first?" Dorian asked. "The northern properties." "Why those?" "Easiest buyers." Selric pointed at another section. "What about Silver Creek?" Celestine smiled. "That one could be worth even more." My stomach tightened. The discussion continued for nearly 30 minutes. Not once did anyone mention conservation. Not once did anyone discuss preserving Octavian's legacy. Every conversation centered on money. Potential buyers. Development opportunities. Profit margins. By the time they finally left, I understood something important. The battle ahead would not be about inheritance. It would not be about family disputes. It would not even be about property. It would be about whether everything Octavian spent his life building could survive the people who stood to gain the most from destroying it. The formal inheritance meeting took place 8 days after the funeral. By then, rumors had already begun spreading through Blackstone Hills. Some believed Octavian Rice had left the majority of his fortune to conservation organizations. Others believed he had secretly donated vast portions of his estate before his death. A few even speculated that the family would spend years fighting one another in court. None of those predictions turned out to be correct. The truth was far more surprising. That morning, I arrived at Mercer & Dane nearly an hour early. The law firm occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower overlooking Harbor City. 4 years, Roland Mercer had handled many of Octavian's legal affairs. He was known for being calm, precise, and extremely difficult to surprise. I would later witness the only time I ever saw that reputation crack. But not yet. When I entered the conference room, only Roland was present. Several folders rested neatly on the table. He glanced up as I approached. "You came early." "So did you." A faint smile crossed his face. "Today will be interesting." I wasn't sure whether that was a warning or an observation. Before I could ask, the door opened. The heirs began arriving. Celestine Voss entered first. Confident. Relaxed. Almost cheerful. Behind her came Dorian Volek, Selric Thorne, and 6 other beneficiaries. They greeted one another with the familiarity of people who already believed they had won. Within minutes, the room filled with conversation. Discussions about future investments. Luxury developments. Potential partnerships. Expansion projects. Nobody talked about conservation. Nobody mentioned wildlife programs. Nobody asked how existing operations would continue. I sat quietly near the far end of the table, listening, observing, waiting. At exactly 10 o'clock, Roland stood. The room immediately settled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began. We are here for the formal execution and review of the final inheritance structure established by Octavian Rice. Several heirs leaned forward. Celestine folded her hands. Roland opened the first folder. Then he began reading. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Specific financial accounts were distributed. Personal possessions were assigned. Vehicles, artwork, private collections. Then came the major assets. The properties. Everyone straightened in their seats. This was the part they cared about. Roland reviewed the first section. Ownership interests in Northern Holdings. Transferred to the heirs. The second section. Regional conservation stations. Transferred to the heirs. The third section. Silver Creek Wildlife Sanctuary. Transferred to the heirs. A ripple moved through the room. Several people exchanged surprised looks. Roland continued. The Eastern Preserves. Transferred. The Red Canyon Facilities. Transferred. The Educational Centers. Transferred. The Agricultural Lands. Transferred. Everything. Every major property. Every operational asset. Every valuable piece of land. Transferred directly to the heirs. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Dorian laughed. A loud, relieved laugh. Others joined him. Smiles spread across the room. Even Roland appeared slightly uncomfortable watching the reaction. Celestine leaned back in her chair. I told you. She looked around the table. I knew he wouldn't lock everything away. Selric grinned. This is better than I expected. Someone else asked for confirmation. Roland reviewed the language again. There was no mistake. The family had inherited virtually everything. Exactly as they hoped. The atmosphere transformed immediately. The tension vanished. Excitement replaced it. People began discussing plans before the meeting had even ended. Future sales. Development proposals. Potential buyers. Projected profits. One heir openly calculated how quickly he could retire. Another discussed purchasing a private island. The conversation felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a celebration. Eventually Celestine turned toward me. A satisfied smile appeared on her face. You look disappointed, Marcus. I met her gaze. I was never expecting anything. She laughed. That's not what I mean. Nobody else spoke. The room seemed interested in the exchange. Celestine continued. You spent years helping him build all those projects. Her tone carried obvious satisfaction. And now they're ours. I said nothing. She interpreted my silence as defeat. That was her first mistake. The second mistake came later. Much later. After the meeting ended, the heirs gathered in the hallway. Several immediately began making phone calls. One contacted a commercial developer. Another contacted a real estate brokerage. The speed was astonishing. They weren't planning to sell. They were already starting. As I walked toward the elevators, Roland called my name. I stopped. He approached quietly. For a moment, he looked toward the group of celebrating heirs. Then back at me. They seem happy. They got what they wanted. Yes. His answer sounded oddly thoughtful. Almost cautious. Then he lowered his voice. Octavian was not a man who left things to chance. I studied him carefully. You're wondering the same thing I am. A brief silence followed. Neither of us elaborated. Neither of us needed to. We both knew Octavian too well. The simplicity of today's outcome felt wrong. Not impossible. Wrong. As though a piece of the puzzle remained hidden. Several weeks passed. Then months. The heirs moved quickly. Faster than anyone expected. Properties entered negotiations. Partnership agreements appeared. Conservation budgets were reduced. Research funding disappeared. Some programs were eliminated entirely. Employees who had dedicated years to the sanctuaries suddenly found themselves unemployed. Others resigned before conditions worsened. Every update I received felt worse than the one before it. At Silver Creek, expansion discussions began. At Red Canyon, sections of protected land were placed under review. Developers toured areas that had never previously been considered for commercial use. The changes accelerated throughout the summer. By early autumn, the heirs had already generated millions from asset transactions. Financial media praised their strategy. The article was published at 6:12 that morning. By noon, it had spread across environmental networks, legal circles, investment groups, and government agencies. By sunset, it was the only thing anyone in the conservation sector was talking about. I read it 3 times. Then a 4th. The headline itself sounded harmless. But the content beneath it was explosive. The report revealed that multiple properties inherited by the Rice heirs were connected to a little-known ecological protection framework established years earlier. The article included scanned documents, federal registration references, environmental compliance agreements, international partnership records, and maps. Detailed maps. Maps showing that several inherited properties formed part of a much larger conservation network stretching across multiple states. I immediately called Ilara Quince. She answered on the first ring. "You've read it. Every word. What do you think?" I stared at the documents on my screen. I think half the investment community is about to panic. Probably. There was no satisfaction in her voice. Only concern. Because the issue wasn't ownership. The heirs still owned the land. The issue was responsibility. The agreements attached legal obligations to those properties. Specific obligations. Strict obligations. Requirements concerning habitat preservation, migration corridors, environmental restoration standards, and ecological monitoring. Many of those requirements extended decades into the future. And according to the documents, those obligations transferred automatically to future owners, including anyone who purchased the land. That changed everything. Within 48 hours, developers began calling lawyers. Lawyers began calling regulators. Regulators began requesting records. And investors started asking uncomfortable questions. Questions the heirs couldn't answer. 3 days later, I drove to Harbor City. The atmosphere inside Mercer and Dane felt very different from the inheritance meeting. Back then, people had been smiling. Now reception staff looked stressed. Phones rang constantly. Conference rooms were occupied. Assistants moved quickly through hallways carrying stacks of documents. When Roland Mercer finally met me, he looked exhausted. "Bad week." He almost laughed. That's one way to describe it. We entered his office. The moment the door closed, he sat heavily behind his desk. "How bad is it?" Roland removed his glasses. "Worse than they're admitting." That answer surprised me. He continued. "Several transactions are already under review. Because of the agreements. Because nobody disclosed them properly." I frowned. Meaning some buyers believe they purchased assets without understanding the full compliance requirements attached to them. That was a serious problem. In some cases, a very expensive problem. Roland opened a folder. Inside were copies of legal notices, potential litigation, contract disputes, regulatory inquiries. The stack was growing rapidly. How did nobody know? I asked. Roland hesitated. Then he said something unexpected. Someone knew. I looked at him. What do you mean? The agreements existed for years. Then why weren't they discussed during the inheritance process? His expression hardened. That's exactly what certain agencies are asking. Before I could respond, his office phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID. His face immediately changed. "Speak of the devil. Who is it?" "Celestine," he answered. I could hear her voice even from across the desk. She sounded furious. Not frustrated. Furious. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, Roland slowly placed the phone down. "Let me guess. She's blaming everyone else." I wasn't wrong. Apparently Celestine had spent the previous week accusing developers, regulators, environmental groups, journalists, and even members of her own family. Everyone except herself. Yet the pressure continued increasing. The following week brought another twist. Federal environmental investigators arrived at multiple inherited properties, including Silver Creek. I watched the inspections personally. Teams reviewed records, surveyed protected zones, examined ongoing construction plans, interviewed staff members. Nothing about the process looked casual. The investigators were thorough. Very thorough. Their presence alone caused additional concern among investors. Several development firms paused involvement immediately. Others suspended funding. One company withdrew entirely. Then the financial consequences began. Property values started falling. Not because the land itself had changed. Because uncertainty had exploded. Nobody wanted to inherit legal complications. Nobody wanted unexpected compliance obligations. Nobody wanted years of regulatory scrutiny. The market reacted exactly as markets often do. It became cautious. And caution costs money. Meanwhile, public attention continued growing. Journalists started digging deeper. Environmental organizations released statements. Industry analysts questioned previous transactions. The heirs found themselves answering questions everywhere they went. Questions they could not easily avoid. One afternoon, while reviewing sanctuary records, I received another call from Alara. This time she sounded more concerned than before. "Marcus, where are you?" "Silver Creek." "Good." The urgency in her voice immediately caught my attention. "What happened?" "We found something." I sat upright. "What kind of something?" There was a pause. Then she answered. "The source archive." I frowned. "What archive?" "The original conservation records." My pulse quickened. Many of those documents were believed lost, dispersed, or buried in private storage years ago. Finding them could change everything. Where? Red Canyon. The name instantly brought back memories. Red Canyon had been one of Octavian's favorite conservation sites. It was also where he and I had that strange conversation years earlier. The one where he predicted exactly what his heirs would do. "When did you find it?" "This morning." "What was inside?" Another pause. Longer this time. When Alara finally spoke, her voice lowered. "Marcus, there are documents in here nobody has ever seen." I stood from my chair. "What kind of documents?" "The kind that explain why Octavian never tried to stop the heirs." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. I arrived at Red Canyon before sunrise. The drive took nearly 4 hours. Most of the route passed through isolated stretches of protected land that Octavian had spent decades acquiring and preserving. As the canyon walls came into view, I couldn't stop thinking about what Alara had said. The kind that explain why Octavian never tried to stop the heirs. That sentence had been repeating in my mind since the phone call. When I reached the conservation station, Alara was already waiting. Several archive boxes sat on a large table inside the records building. Each carried old inventory labels. Many hadn't been opened in years. Some probably hadn't been touched since Octavian personally stored them. Alara handed me a pair of gloves. "You should see this yourself." I opened the nearest box. Inside were hundreds of pages. Environmental agreements. Correspondence. Regulatory approvals. Meeting records. Nothing unusual at first. Then I noticed dates. The documents stretched back much further than expected. Some were over 15 years old. Others nearly 20. The deeper we searched, the stranger things became. Octavian had documented everything. Every negotiation. Every partnership. Every obligation attached to the conservation network. There were notes in his handwriting. Private assessments. Legal reviews. Strategic projections. And one recurring topic appeared again and again. The heirs. I stopped reading. Then looked at Elara. He was planning around them. She nodded. Keep going. I continued. Several documents contained evaluations of future risks. Not environmental risks. Family risks. Octavian had commissioned independent experts to analyze what might happen after his death. The findings were remarkably accurate. The reports predicted that certain heirs would likely attempt rapid liquidation of conservation assets. Others predicted pressure from outside investors. Some warned that development interests would move aggressively if ownership changed. The reports even named specific vulnerabilities, including Celestine Voss. I stared at the pages. Years before any of this happened, experts had essentially predicted the current crisis. And Octavian had taken those predictions seriously. Very seriously. Then we discovered a sealed folder. Unlike the other files, this one carried a handwritten note. For execution only if conditions are met. Neither of us spoke. Elara carefully opened it. Inside sat several legal documents. And a letter. The letter was addressed to Roland Mercer. Not to me. Not to the family. To Roland. I immediately called him. To my surprise, he answered. When I explained what we had found, his response was immediate. I'm coming. He arrived late that afternoon. The moment he entered the archive room, he saw the folder. His expression changed instantly. You found it. That caught my attention. You knew this existed? Roland exhaled slowly. I knew it might. Octavian never showed it to me. He pointed toward the note. But he told me there was one final instruction package hidden somewhere inside the network. For the next hour, the three of us reviewed the contents together. The material was extraordinary. Not because it transferred ownership. Not because it redirected money. Because it explained intent. Every decision. Every structure. Every inheritance mechanism. The entire strategy. Then we reached the final document. A supplemental instruction attached to the estate framework. Roland began reading silently. Halfway through, he stopped. His eyes narrowed. He reread the paragraph. Then he read it again. Neither Elara nor I interrupted. For the first time since I had known him, Roland Mercer looked genuinely stunned. What is it? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the final page. Then his eyes locked onto a single sentence. The room became completely silent. A moment later, Roland whispered, No. What? He looked up slowly. The expression on his face told me everything. Whatever he had just discovered was important. Very important. Finally, he read the sentence aloud. Any heir who voluntarily liquidates conservation assets automatically assumes all restoration liabilities attached to those assets and forfeits any claim against the estate for resulting losses. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, the only sound came from the air conditioning system humming in the background. I replayed the sentence in my head. Then the meaning hit me. Hard. The liabilities didn't remain with the estate. They transferred. Personally. Directly. To whichever heir chose liquidation. I looked at Roland. That's enforceable. His answer came immediately. If the supporting agreements remain valid. He stopped. Then looked toward the stacks of archive material surrounding us. Thousands of pages. Original records. Signed commitments. Verified documentation. Evidence. The answer was obvious. The agreements remained valid, which meant the heirs had walked directly into a legal structure designed years before Octavian died. Not a trap. A choice. An informed choice. One they voluntarily made. Suddenly his earlier comment made perfect sense. Octavian never wanted to stop them. He wanted them to reveal themselves. And once they did, the consequences activated automatically. That evening, Roland requested an emergency meeting with the heirs. The gathering was scheduled for the following week at Mercer and Dane. News of the meeting spread quickly. By then, investors were already nervous. Developers were already withdrawing. Regulators were already investigating. Nobody knew what Roland planned to reveal. Not even the heirs. Especially not the heirs. When the meeting day finally arrived, the atmosphere couldn't have been more different from the inheritance reading months earlier. Back then they celebrated. Now they looked worried. Celestine entered the conference room first. Her confidence had faded. Dorian appeared exhausted. Selric looked anxious. Others exchanged nervous glances as they took their seats. Roland stood at the head of the table. A thick stack of documents rested beside him. I sat quietly near the wall, watching, waiting. The room settled. Roland opened the folder. Then he began reading. The week after Roland revealed the supplemental instruction, chaos erupted. Not publicly at first. Most of the damage happened behind closed doors. Private meetings. Emergency consultations. Late-night conference calls. Crisis management teams. The heirs desperately searched for a way out. Unfortunately for them, every path seemed to lead back to the same conclusion. They had voluntarily approved the sales. They had signed the transactions. They had ignored warnings. And now they were responsible. The first cracks appeared within the family itself. Arguments turned into accusations. Accusations turned into threats. Threats turned into legal action. Several heirs hired separate attorneys. Others began distancing themselves from decisions they had previously supported. Nobody wanted responsibility. Everyone wanted someone else to blame. At first, Celestine focused her anger on Roland. Then on regulators. Then on environmental agencies. Then on journalists. But none of those explanations survived scrutiny. The documents were valid. The obligations were real. The signatures belonged to the heirs. Eventually investigators uncovered something unexpected. A pattern. A financial pattern. One that appeared repeatedly across multiple transactions. The same name kept surfacing. Varric Sloane. I wasn't surprised to hear it. I knew who he was. Everyone involved in the inheritance process knew who he was. For years, Varric had operated as a high-end financial strategist. He specialized in asset restructuring and large-scale property transactions. Following Octavian's death, he quickly became one of Celestine's most trusted advisors. In public, he presented himself as a brilliant strategist. Calm, confident, professional. The kind of person wealthy clients relied upon. But investigators had started asking difficult questions. Questions Varric couldn't answer. Questions involving hidden payments, undisclosed commissions, side agreements, and financial incentives buried deep inside transaction records. The first major discovery came from a developer involved in one of the northern property sales. During a regulatory review, auditors uncovered unusual compensation arrangements. Money had been transferred through multiple consulting entities. The structure looked complicated, but the purpose was simple. Someone had been paid to accelerate transactions. Someone had benefited every time a property changed hands. That someone was Varric. The investigation expanded immediately. What authorities found shocked everyone. including the heirs. Varric had secretly collected commissions from multiple buyers while simultaneously advising the heirs during negotiations. In some cases, he earned money from both sides of the same deal. That alone was serious. But it wasn't the worst part. The worst part emerged from internal communications. Emails, messages, recorded calls, meeting summaries. The evidence painted a clear picture. Repeatedly, legal concerns had been raised. Repeatedly, compliance issues had been discussed. Repeatedly, environmental obligations had been mentioned. And repeatedly, Varric pushed transactions forward anyway. Sometimes he minimized risks. Sometimes he dismissed concerns. Sometimes he simply failed to share critical information. The result was always the same. Faster sales. Bigger commissions. More money for him. When news reached Celestine, she refused to believe it. At first. Then the evidence continued growing. One document became especially damaging. An internal message sent months earlier. In it, a partner asked Varric whether certain environmental obligations should be disclosed more aggressively during negotiations. His response was blunt. If they slow down to examine every complication, these deals won't close. The message spread quickly among investigators. Then among lawyers. Then among the heirs themselves. The reaction was explosive. Within days, Celestine filed suit against Varric. Several other heirs followed. Investors filed claims. Developers filed claims. Business partners filed claims. The man who once sat at the center of their strategy suddenly found himself surrounded by lawsuits. And matters became even worse. Federal authorities opened a fraud investigation. The possibility of criminal charges transformed everything. People who previously defended Varric now rushed to distance themselves. Former colleagues stopped speaking publicly. Consultants disappeared. Associates hired lawyers. The entire network around him began collapsing. Meanwhile, the family continued falling apart. Relationships that survived for decades disintegrated within months. Siblings stopped speaking. Cousins sued cousins. Private arguments became public court filings. Every hearing revealed new details. Every document created fresh embarrassment. Every week brought another setback. Financial pressure intensified. Several development projects were cancelled outright. Banks tightened lending requirements. Insurance costs increased. Property valuations dropped again. Some heirs quietly sold personal assets to maintain liquidity. Others borrowed heavily. A few approached the edge of bankruptcy. The contrast was astonishing. Less than a year earlier, they had celebrated becoming extraordinarily wealthy. Now many were fighting simply to stay financially afloat. One afternoon, I visited Silver Creek. The sanctuary had endured months of uncertainty. Funding shortages. Staff reductions. Operational disruptions. Yet despite everything, life continued. Researchers remained committed. Volunteers kept showing up. Wildlife programs survived. As I walked along a monitoring trail, Elara joined me. For a while neither of us spoke. We simply observed the wetlands. Finally she broke the silence. Have you heard about Varric? Only what's public. He may face criminal charges. I nodded. The outcome no longer surprised me. Actions eventually create consequences. Sometimes quickly. Sometimes years later. But eventually. Elara looked across the sanctuary. Do you think Octavian expected this? I considered the question carefully. No. She raised an eyebrow. No. I think he expected greed. I glanced toward the water. But I don't think he expected Varric. That was the truth. Octavian had planned for reckless heirs. He had planned for liquidation attempts. He had planned for pressure from investors. But Varric represented something different. A catalyst. Nearly 2 years after Octavian Rice's death, the final major hearings began. By that point, the inheritance battle had transformed into something far larger than a family dispute. Environmental agencies were involved. Federal regulators were involved. Multiple courts were involved. Investors, developers, creditors, and conservation organizations all had interests tied to the outcome. What started as a celebration of inherited wealth had become one of the most complicated legal conflicts anyone in the region could remember. I attended every major hearing. Not because I was required to. Because I wanted to see how the story ended. The federal courthouse stood in the center of Harbor City. Every time I entered, I saw familiar faces. Lawyers carrying stacks of documents. Journalists waiting for updates. Experts preparing testimony. And members of the Rice family who looked very different from the confident people I met at the inheritance reading. Time had not been kind to them. Celestine Voss looked exhausted. The pressure had taken a visible toll. Dorian appeared older. Selric rarely spoke. Several heirs no longer attended together. Many arrived separately. Many left separately. The unity they once displayed had disappeared completely. During the hearings, experts presented years of evidence. Environmental obligations. Financial records. Inheritance structures. Compliance requirements. Archived agreements. Everything was examined. Everything was challenged. Everything was verified. Yet one question remained unresolved. What would happen to the surviving conservation properties? Several sites had already been sold. Others remained tied up in legal disputes. A handful continued operating under temporary arrangements. The court needed a permanent solution. That answer arrived during the final phase of proceedings. A legal team representing the estate introduced documents that had received little attention until then. At first they appeared routine. Trust records. Governance documents. Administrative filings. Then the details became clear. A dormant conservation trust existed. It had existed for years. Long before Octavian died. Long before the inheritance meeting. Long before the heirs began selling anything. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter as the structure was explained. The trust had never activated because specific conditions had to be met first. Conditions tied directly to the preservation obligations attached to the conservation network. The judge reviewed the documents carefully. So did every attorney present. Then came the crucial question. Had those conditions been triggered? The answer was yes. Repeated compliance failures. Repeated violations. Repeated attempts to dismantle protected conservation systems. The requirements had been satisfied. The trust was now active. A murmur spread throughout the courtroom. I looked toward the heirs. Several seemed confused. Others looked alarmed. Then the next revelation arrived. The trust would assume control of certain remaining protected zones. Not the heirs. Not developers. Not outside investors. The trust. And the governing board had already been defined years earlier. Scientists. Conservation specialists. Community representatives. Environmental educators. Individuals selected specifically to preserve the long-term mission of the network. No family member held controlling authority. No private investor controlled decisions. No developer could redirect operations. The structure insulated the surviving conservation lands from exactly the type of pressure Octavian had feared. The judge approved the transition. Just like that, years of planning finally reached their conclusion. The reaction was immediate. Conservation organizations celebrated. Researchers expressed relief. Local communities welcomed the decision. Funding partners who had remained cautious suddenly returned. Projects restarted. Programs resumed. Staff positions were restored. The recovery process would take time, But at least there was now a future worth rebuilding. As for the heirs, the outcome was very different. The liabilities remained. The lawsuits remained. The financial consequences remained. Several settlements drained enormous amounts of money. Some heirs sold luxury properties. Others liquidated investments. A few spent years untangling debts created during the crisis. Their greatest loss, however, wasn't financial. It was opportunity. They had inherited one of the most respected conservation networks in the country. They could have protected it, expanded it, strengthened it. Instead, they viewed it as a collection of assets waiting to be converted into cash. That decision changed everything. The consequences followed. Varric Sloane's situation ended badly as well. Investigations eventually resulted in multiple fraud-related findings. His professional reputation collapsed. Former clients abandoned him. Business partnerships disappeared. The influence he spent years building vanished faster than he believed possible. For a man who chased short-term profit at every opportunity, the long-term cost proved devastating. Several months after the final ruling, I returned to Silver Creek. The sanctuary looked healthier than it had in years. Research teams were active again. Visitors filled the education center. Students participated in wildlife programs. Conservation vehicles moved along restored service roads. The atmosphere felt hopeful. I spent most of the afternoon walking familiar trails. Places I had visited hundreds of times before. Places Octavian loved. Eventually, I reached the observation deck overlooking the wetlands. The same location where we had spoken years earlier. The same place where he predicted his heirs would come for the land. Back then, I hadn't fully understood what he meant. Now I did. He never believed greed could be eliminated. He believed it could be revealed. And once revealed, people would be judged by the choices they made. Standing there, I realized something else. Octavian never defeated his heirs. They defeated themselves. Every warning existed. Every responsibility was documented. Every choice remained theirs. The outcome simply reflected those choices. As the sun began setting over Silver Creek, I looked across the sanctuary one final time. The wildlife remained protected. The conservation network survived.